final consenting policy improvement is on board planola resourcing, and for them to have average decision times of 1.5 years. So IWEA's pipeline survey has shown a mass increase of projects coming on stream, which is going to see a huge uplift in pre-application engagements and applications to onboard planola. And just maybe to note here, these projects are going to be much larger in scale. We're talking 700 megawatts on average, and them being in the marine environment is going to make them that much more complex, and something that onboard planola haven't dealt with before. So really, it's imperative that onboard planola and the associated departments, Department of Housing, Department of Environment, and other bodies like the National Parks and Wildlife Service are well resourced. And as well as being well resourced, they need that requisite expertise, for the marine space, so they're able to process this mass uplift. So we'd really recommend that a resource roadmap for offshore wind specifically is published to facilitate this increase in projects entering the system. And as I mentioned at the top, we want to see planning decisions being processed, on average within 1.5 years. And this is really going to ensure we can hit our 2030 targets. So just to conclude, the slide summarizes the 4 planning-related policy improvements required to deliver our 5 gigawatt target by 2030. So you can all see them there. We've gone through them in quite a bit of detail. I suppose what I wanted to flag before I pass on to my colleague Noel is that the result of these policy improvements will be an additional 890 megawatts added onto our baseline scenario that we spoke about at the start, and it's going to go some way to progressing offshore wind in Ireland and achieving our targets. So listen, thanks a million for listening, and look forward to fielding any questions in the Q&A. So I'll pass you on to my colleague now.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Ross. Hopefully you can all see my screen and hear me okay. Great. So thanks a million, Ross, for going through all the consenting side of the report. And what I'm going to do over the next 15-20 minutes or so is take you through the grid offers and the grid delivery and RES policy improvements that we've suggested in the report. As Ross mentioned, what we've done at the beginning of the report is we've tried to condense down the policy improvements into hopefully an easy to understand table that if you have to take something away from the document, take a look at these 2 pages with the 8 policy improvements. You'll see a very brief description of what each of them are, who the actors are to implement them, so who's the lead and who's the supporting role, what the next step is to actually progress these, so how do we actually get this moving, and then what's the target date to actually deliver upon them. And what we've done beside all of that is we've taken each one individually and layered it upon the next one. And you'll see there that you get an additional quantity of megawatts connected onto the system for each one of them. Important to say that it looks like some have more of an impact than the other, but what you're actually seeing is the cumulative benefit from doing all of the previous policy improvements added upon this. So things like RES and grid delivery add on a huge benefit when all of the previous policy improvements are done. So with that, I might get into some of the grid aspects of the equation first. And the first thing I want to take you through is one of our main recommendations from the report. And it's actually coming out of the grid options consultation paper, which was held quite recently. For anyone that isn't aware, over the last 12 months or so, there's been a huge amount of debate over what grid model should be applied for Ireland over the next decade and beyond that. It really stemmed from the Climate Action Plan, which was published in June 2019. In the Climate Action Plan, there was an action for a grid model consultation to be held. So when the Climate Action Plan was published, EirGrid engaged with consultants Navigant to produce a very substantial report looking at various grid delivery models for Ireland. That was published in June alongside a consultation paper from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, as they were called at the time. Asking questions around what is the best type of a grid model for Ireland over the next decade and beyond. So getting into some of the options that were produced in that paper or put forward in that paper, it can be summarized through this very handy summary graphic. It looked at 4 different options, and they ranged from a developer-led model through to a plan-led model. The developer-led model is very much the developer taking the lead on deciding where their project should be located, where they should connect to the grid, how to assess their site, how to carry out the environmental analysis, ultimately permitting the site, constructing it, and owning it. And that's not just the offshore turbines themselves and the offshore substation, but also the offshore grid connection. And that there was several then different iterations from option 2 to option 3, which tend to flip more towards a plan-led approach. And then option 4, which is quite a extreme version of a plan-led approach, where you would have a state body alongside the TSO identify sites, permit those sites for a certain quantity of megawatts, and bring those forward to a state where effectively developers would then bid on the location, the grid connection, the timeline, to bring those forward into an auction. And then the developer would actually construct the wind farm itself, with the construction of the transmission system assets owned and operated and constructed by the transmission system operator in EirGrid and the transmission asset owner in ESB Networks. So the consultation looked across all of these 4 different options and the positives and negatives on hitting 2030 targets, on how they might impact things like future-proofing, community engagement, buildability, cost effectiveness. There was a very large number of different factors considered in that consultation. And what we in IWEA did, we produced quite a substantial consultation response, which we submitted to DEC earlier in the summer. And our key message coming out of here was, after looking at all the 4 options and really going into the detail on what is and is not possible before 2030 and after 2030, where we landed upon was that the developer-led model as a base, which is option 1, should be progressed with components of option 2. So where option 2 differed is there was a larger role in option 2 for the transmission system operator and possibly a state body to identify where exactly the project should be connected to the grid. And also there was a lot in there around the strategic development of the transmission system to be able to build the grid with the understanding that the projects would connect to the grid and they would be used. Whereas option 1 was a bit more identify exactly what projects are going to proceed, and then at that point in time, begin developing the grid from that stage onwards to effectively have the grid capacity optimized for where the projects would be located, but at a much slower pace. So we felt when we looked at all the positives and negatives of each of the options, there's a lot. It really comes down to timelines for needing to proceed with option 1 or 2. We have a lot of projects in the pipeline, as Ross has already spoken about. These have had quite a significant amount of investment placed in them, survey work, and also the developers behind all those projects, the vast majority of them have international experience with delivering offshore wind farms in decentralized models. So we've a lot of confidence that industry can do what it needs to do to get up to 5 gigawatts delivered on the system by 2030. Looking at the more plan-led models, there was a couple of pieces of the puzzle there which weren't yet in place. So there wasn't really any understanding around how a state body could permit projects, for example. We were still working our way through the MPDM bill that Ross has spoken about, and we still are today at the time. So where we've landed upon is that we believe you need a developer-led model to be able to deliver on 2030 targets. And when we were putting together the Building Offshore Wind report, we felt that this was such a fundamental requirement for the report that we have taken that as our underlying assumption for all of the other policy improvements that we progress. If you were to go ahead and develop a centralized model to progress phase 1 and phase 2 projects before 2030, there's a whole amount of re-examining of all of the subsequent policy improvements that would need to happen. we would definitely not meet our target of 5 gigawatts by 2030 if you were to proceed down that direction. So for that reason, everything I'm about to talk about is predicated on phase 1 and phase 2 projects between now and 2030. Will be a developer-led model connecting onto the grid, and ideally with strategic development of the transmission system by EirGrid and by ESP networks in parallel to that, so that we can get the projects connected to the system and energized. And when they're energized, the capacity will be waiting on the system for them. For those of you curious as to what we thought post 2030, where we came down to on this is that when you really start to tap into the 20 or 30 gigawatts of export potential that's identified in the program for government, it makes a little more sense to go down the plan-led approach that's zoned appropriately, and that can really take into account optimized grid locations, optimized locations for offshore network. So we're talking bulk transmission reinforcements offshore that developers might then connect into. And it makes a lot of sense in that world when you're talking such a magnitude of power, particularly most likely off the West Coast and some of the South Coast, to bring that through a plan-led approach. However, that transition from the developer-led approach to the plan-led approach needs to be very clearly signposted and very clearly roadmapped between now and 2030 on exactly how that model is going to transition from the pre-2030 model to the post-2030 model. Very important, there's a lot of transparency. And we actually felt that rather than going into the specific details of what a plan-led model might look like beyond 2030, that perhaps it would be prudent to consult on that at a later point in time, once we know exactly what the pre-2030 model is, how we can improve upon that, and how we can then build on it to deliver the 30 gigawatt potential mentioned in the program for government. So moving on then to my next slide, I'd like to just take you through the steps actually involved in a grid connection and how to energize projects. Ross touched on this a little earlier. What we did at the beginning of our modeling is we looked at the sequential steps that all projects need to get through in order to go from the planning phase to the grid connection phase to the route to market phase, and then ultimately to construction, financial close, and development. And if you take a baseline scenario, and it's difficult to come up with a baseline scenario for offshore because it doesn't really exist. The only project we've developed offshore was over 15 years ago. Things have changed very much since then. So what we've tried to do is we've gathered around all of the experts in our offshore side of the house and many of the experts in the onshore side of the house in IWEA to look at the sequential steps that you might carry out in a business as usual case. And if you look at the steps that you'd need to take post consent, so after you've got consent for the wind farm itself, everything that Ross has spoken about previously, the next steps then are to enter into an auction for phase 1 projects, I should say. Phase 2 projects, this is the timeline for phase 1 projects. Phase 2 projects, very similar timeline, especially post developer consent. It just happens a little bit later in the decade. So the example is good for both. But what you do first is you would go into an auction, you'd win in an auction, and then what would typically happen in a current business as usual point in time is that once you have your route to market secured, then you can finalize your grid connection offer and seek consent for that. So it's very, very difficult under current policies to actually progress grid consenting in parallel with the consent for the wind farm, but it's something that we need to do. After you achieve your grid offer and after you get consent for your grid connection, which can take a substantial amount of time, it's about getting that final MAC that Ross spoke about. Then you enter your financial investment decision phase where the project will achieve financial close. You'll begin constructing the wind farm and you'll begin constructing the grid in order to connect your wind farm to the system. You'll then likely energize the project in phases depending on the project size. Typically phases are of the order of maybe 400 to 500 megawatts, and they would then connect onto the system. So what we're trying to show here is that if you follow all of these, once you achieve consent for your project, it takes about 7 years from final consent to energization. and that is an enormous amount of time. And there's too much sequential steps happening here and not enough parallel steps. So what we're looking to do is try and improve upon those, and we've got a couple of policy improvements on the grid side, which helps with that. So the first one I would mention is that collaboration on connection policy and grid delivery is absolutely essential. We've seen really, really good work from the CRU over the past 12 to 18 months on developing the onshore connection policy to the point that it's in incredibly good condition to bring us to our 2030 targets. There's annual batches. It's very well signposted. It optimizes large-scale renewable deployment in order to hit 2030 targets. And what we need to see on the offshore side of the house is very similar collaboration between the CRU, between EirGrid, between ESP networks, and between industry in order to make sure that the connection policy and the design behind it has the exact same level of engagement throughout the process, very well consulted upon, and very well understood for when we progress into res auctions. And I'll get onto that in a minute about why that's so important. Now, in collaboration with that and beside that, we actually need very good early engagement on a separate point, and that's with EirGrid and Onboard Planola and the projects. We need to be able to move the steps for achieving consent for your wind farm and the step for achieving consent for your grid connection away from being sequential steps and try to do it at the exact same time. The MPDM bill has some outlines as to how it might implement this, but it is quite vague, and it's something that we do need to work upon. So it's really important that Onboard Planola and EirGrid are resourced sufficiently to allow early engagement with projects so that projects have enough confidence to bring their grid connection routes to the consenting stage at a much earlier point in time. And another reason that is important, and these 2 points are really important, is around how the connection offer process interacts with the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme. So what we have at the moment in the onshore renewable area is projects achieve planning permission, then they achieve a grid connection offer that they receive from the system operators through the enduring connection process, or ECP it's called. And then once they have an ECP offer, they qualify to enter into the res auction. However, when you're talking about offshore projects, they're at such a significant scale that it's very difficult to progress the exact same sequential steps in order to hit 2030 targets. It's also a case where you might give capacity out to multiple projects who are then unsuccessful in a res auction, which might lead to a huge amount of capacity on the grid not being utilized, for example, if certain projects are not successful in a res auction and they might need to wait until the next res auction to proceed. So there is absolutely a balance that needs to be met on the connection offer process development, so that projects have enough legal certainty on their actual method and their route. So where is my project connecting to on the system? How much is that going to cost? And what timeline is that going to deliver to? And that will then allow them to have confidence in creating their bid and their price, and going into an auction knowing that they can achieve a contract. From the system operator's point of view, we're absolutely aware that there needs to be some I guess, metric to use grid capacity as efficiently as possible. It might not make sense to give grid connection offers with very long end dates to all of the projects in advance of a res auction. It might make more sense to give out an offer that has enough certainty on the method, the costs, and the timelines that then becomes finalized once the actual auction is in place. Again, it goes back to the collaboration point. There's a lot to be worked out between, I think, the regulator, the system operators, and industry on those. And it's important that those types of conversations begin as quickly as possible. And then the final point is really around commitments. So once you have your connection offer, once you have your res contract, it's very important that we then see commitments made from the developer side, so that there's, again, reinsurance to the system operators and to the regulators that these are proceeding as planned. The last point then I'd just like to make on the grid connection and delivery is around opportunities for connection points and really optimizing the transmission grid. And Rory is going to talk a lot more about this after me, but it really comes down to EirGrid producing another version of what's called the East Coast Generation Opportunity Assessment Report. I'd say it's a report that's been read front to back by thousands of people over the last 2 years to try and figure out where I can connect my project on the East Coast. And what we need to see now, I think, is an updated version of that, which considers the entire coastline for pre-2030 projects. So an updated version of the East Coast and the South Coast, and then some indications on the West Coast also, if there are any pre-30 projects that can develop there. And again, it's really about optimizing grid capacity. So where is there capacity already? What are the easiest transmission projects to bring forward? And where is it best to connect my project? And wrapping all of that up between the EirGrid and ESP networks, there's an incredibly important piece of work ongoing at the moment, and that is the Price Review 5. So it's quite rare that we as an industry have identified, we as a country have identified such an opportunity for offshore wind to progress in a 10-year timescale. And at the same point in time, we have two of the major stakeholders in that process, EirGrid and ESP networks, actually asking for a budget for the next 5 years. We're not coming in with the ask to deliver 5 gigawatts of offshore wind midway through a budget cycle where it takes time to alter plans, or you might be limited in what you can do. We're actually bringing that forward right at the beginning of the 2021 to 2025 budget cycle. So the CRU are at the moment debating the results of the Price Review 5 decision. This decision will effectively give the budget for EirGrid and ESP networks for the next 5 years to develop the transmission system, to put time and effort into things like optimizing the DS3 program for 2030, and to really work with developers for that early stage engagement for how you can bring projects forward. We're expecting a decision on this in the next couple of weeks, but it is absolutely critical that the output of this is sufficient resources for EirGrid and ESP networks to be able to deliver what they need to do between now and 2025. Moving on just to the res aspect of things, once you have your grid connection offer process sorted, you have your grid delivery process sorted because of the resourcing in EirGrid and ESP networks. The next real function of the Building Offshore Wind report is res auctions and route to market. And there's been a very helpful timeline developed by Robert McGuinness and the team in DEC on target timelines for future offshore auctions. And it's great to see that they have 3 auctions planned. So what you're seeing here is quite a detailed breakdown from 2021 for that auction process, where we expect to see a consultation on the draft terms and conditions for the first offshore res following the enactment of the MPDM bill, which is expected Q1, Q2 2021. Then the final terms and conditions will be published in Q3, and then the launch for pre-qualification will take place in Q4 2021. Very likely just taking almost a lessons learned from the onshore res auction that we saw this year. Very likely that the auction itself will then be held in maybe May 2022. So there was about a 4 or 5 month turnaround time between the end of the pre-qualification on the onshore side and the actual auction taking place itself. This is the auction that the phase 1 projects will participate in. So it's coming quite quickly. And there is a number of steps which it will not be possible for the phase 1 projects to achieve prior to that. So things like achieving full planning consent when the MPDM bill will only be enacted a few months prior to the pre-qualification. So there's a lot of complexity around how you design an auction when the projects themselves might not have full planning permission at that point in time. And then running the auction with, again, a bit more risk and uncertainty in there for the projects compared to what you might have seen for the onshore auction. So getting the terms and conditions right and engaging with the developers on what exactly they can deliver upon, what information they need in advance of the auction to give as much certainty as possible when they're bidding in will be absolutely critical. The next two auctions then in 2023 and 2025 is very likely where you'll see the phase 2 projects begin to come in 2023. And then certainly the large bulk of the phase 2 projects will be delivering in 2025. And we really see these three auctions as an absolutely essential requirement to hit the 5 gigawatt target for 2030. I guess one of the good things that we've seen from our modeling is that policy improvements 1 to 6 are requirements regardless of what capacity you want to hit for offshore by 2030, whether it be the 3.5 gigawatt target in the Climate Action Plan or the 5 gigawatt target in the programme for government. You need to do policy improvements 1 to 6. Policy improvement 7 around the three auctions then is where you determine your volume that you actually procure. So whether that's the smaller volume of 3.5 or the updated volume of 5 gigawatts, it's your competitions and your res that really determine what that is, along with the grid capacity, which Rory will talk about shortly. Just to give a bit more or put a bit more flesh onto this, some of the considerations that we've put in the report for res auction design that we'd love to engage with DEC on, and I'm sure there will be lots of engagement over the next few months on these things for the first auction. We've produced a position paper on this, which probably won't surprise anyone in the audience. We have a position paper for pretty much everything in the offshore space, which is great. And all of them are actually linked at the end of the Building Offshore Wind report, which might be quite handy for some of you. The first point I'd like to just touch on is indexation. So I think when we look back on the first onshore auction, that took place earlier, decision to not index that auction, we estimate added about 10 to 12 euro onto the bid price for those onshore auctions. For offshore, I think that needs to be reconsidered. There's a very good win in terms of public acceptance of offshore wind if we see lower prices naturally. And then there's a lot more consideration around the actual costs that go into developing an offshore wind farm. It's on a much larger scale than you might see on an onshore wind farm. And there's a lot more ongoing costs for things like O&M, which are impacted by things like inflation. So definitely a worthwhile consideration to have for the offshore auctions. The second point is just around the delivery penalties. So what we saw in the Res 1 auction for onshore was that there was an end date for when projects that were successful in the auction could actually deliver. So you needed to be connected onto the system and energized before 2023. This led to a number of projects not going into the auction or carrying very high levels of risk. And what we've learned in the last few weeks is that there's a number of projects which might not have proceeded with their implementation agreement, having been successful in the auction because of issues with their delivery timelines and a lot of risk being carried now to hit that 2023 deadline. What we had proposed in our submission to the draft terms and conditions for Res 1 is that rather than a cliff edge of support, it would be an erosion of support. So your end date for your feed-in tariff, or not your feed-in tariff, but your strike price is fixed, and then your energization date determines the quantity of support that you get and the number of years you get. It's a much more manageable risk for the developers and a much cleaner outcome, we feel, especially given all the uncertainties around offshore, the consenting side of offshore that still remains to be seen. The next one is quite a big one again, and it's nearly another lessons learned from the Res 1 auction and something that we feel quite strongly about, not just for the future offshore auctions, but also onshore. It's really about moving the risk of constraint and curtailment away from the developer who has effectively zero control over that to a more centrally managed process through the department and most likely the system operator. As you'll see in Rory's slide, and we might touch back on it in the Q&A afterwards, constraint and curtailment and dispatch down in general is one of the biggest challenges for hitting 2030 targets. And once you're a developer, you build your project, you connect it onto the system, you have no control over what constraint levels you see or what the curtailment levels on the system are. You are bringing an uncontrollable risk from your point of view into the auction, and trying to forecast that over the lifetime of your project to then bid in for and lock it into a 15-year contract. So regardless of whether constraint and curtailment are managed better or solved, the price of that ultimately falls upon the consumer for 15 years because it's been locked into your contract. So a lot of changes needed around there. Just quite quickly, some of the other ones that we believe are definitely worth consideration. Pay as clear auction instead of a pay as bid. This is very good for price discovery, really good for a first time auction, we feel, for offshore wind, particularly when there is no good reference point or price in Ireland. It also helps with, I guess, the developers bringing forward the actual levelized cost of energy that they need to represent in the auction. There's much less auction dynamics in this type of world where you're not as potentially worried about what your competitors are doing. I think we saw in the Res 1 auction this year that there was a little bit of maybe changes of prices to try and identify the marginal project that would clear in a pay as bid auction. So I think that could be definitely avoided in a pay as clear auction. And then the last two, I think, are really around the level of interaction with DEC and industry, and making sure that the timing of auctions and the terms and conditions around them can bring forward enough competition to deliver the auctions in good time to hit the targets, but also to deliver good competition and prices and best value for the consumer. So it's really, again, about the level of engagement. And as I mentioned, I think the key takeaway here is that policy improvements 1 to 6 need to be implemented, and then things like RES and things like grid capacity development determine the volumes that you're actually going to see on the system by 2030. So just to summarize what I've talked about there before handing over to Rory, on the grid connections and the grid delivery side of things, if we can implement policy improvement 5 and 6 in our study, what you're going to see is you're going to see an additional 1,400 megawatts of capacity delivered by 2030 compared to the baseline scenario. So a huge amount of volume there that can be delivered if you implement both of those, and if you make sure that EirGrid, ESB Networks and Onboard Planola, along with supporting departments and other state bodies, have the resources required to hit the 5 gigawatt target. Key assumption there underpinning all of that is that phase 1 and phase 2 projects must be developed under a developer-led offshore grid model to 2030. On the RES side of things, ensuring we have 3 auctions that take place between now and 2025, and that the first auction takes place as soon as possible, then brings you to your next batch of projects that can be delivered by 2030. With really good auction design, we feel that can unlock an additional 2,100 megawatts of capacity between now and 2030. So I might just stop there, and I'll hand you over to Rory for the next part of the presentation, and he'll take you through some of the changes required on the transmission system and grid capacity. Thanks.
Thanks, Noel. I'll just share. I'm just trying to share my slides there. I think I need it to be enabled to me. Let me do it. Yeah, there we go. Okay, good afternoon. What I'm going to be covering off today is the important area of providing the grid capacity for the offshore projects. As we already seen from the first Slido, I think everybody understands how grid capacity and developing sufficient capacity for the projects required to meet 2030 targets, both offshore and onshore, is going to be a big challenge. So I'm just going to go through this issue in a bit more detail. So I'm going to talk a wee bit about what the problem is, what we view the solutions are, and how can we do it. Apologies. It's frozen there a second. Oh, very good now. Okay, thank you. Okay, so in terms of what the problem is, so what we're trying to do is connect with the phase 1 projects up to 4 gigawatts of generation, primarily along the east coast of Ireland. And then, moving into the phase 2 projects, also required to achieve the government's 5 gigawatts targets, we'll probably have to connect some more onto the east coast and some onto the south coast. We've already looked, particularly ERGOT have already looked a bit at this problem. As Noel already mentioned, there was the first east coast sort of capacity study, which did show that 1,500 megawatts, maybe even up to 2 gigawatts, could be accommodated on the existing system. I think ERGOT are doing more studies at the moment to look at, exactly how the phase 1 projects can connect and what reinforcements are required. Usefully, they also did work in 2019 on the tomorrow energy scenarios. And one of the scenarios they actually studied was allowing for up to 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind, the centralized energy scenario. And what we basically done was we took the results from that and we've actually mapped it. And on the right-hand side here, you can see the overloads that are shown in the wider Dublin area. They've obviously results as well for the whole of Ireland. And any of the lines that are in the darker colours, particularly the red, the blue, and the purple, they're showing quite high overloads in at times particularly when there's very high wind on the system. So it's very clear, from the analysis that ERGOT already done, is that if we are going to accommodate 3.5-4 gigawatts of wind on the east coast, it is going to drive quite a lot of overloads of the existing system. So that's sort of clear evidence that we are going to have to upgrade the system. So I think the problem is quite clear, and that's not just in the Dublin area. You can even see the lines going north out of Dublin and even the lines then south down towards Arklow. They're also showing similar levels of overloads. And then in around Dublin, you can basically see that, while the generators might be connecting in around Carrickmines, Pilbeg, because a lot of the demand in Dublin, particularly the growth in demand, is more in the west and the northwest, it's likely that there's also going to have to be some additional reinforcements and circuits built, from the east to the west of Dublin as well. So what are the solutions? Very much plan probably A, B, and C is we need to build more grid infrastructure. And as I mentioned, that within Dublin probably means, some additional cables and maybe replacing some of the existing cables that have been there for quite a long time, maybe with larger cables. There might also be some opportunities for some of the circuits in and around Dublin to do some upgrades on some of the overhead lines. We'll probably need some new substations as well to facilitate this. And then as the tomorrow energy scenario map is shown there, you can see that going north out of Dublin and south as well, there's also going to be reinforcements required, maybe of overhead lines north of Dublin, and then south of Dublin, there's an existing circuit running from Carrickmines to Arklow, and that probably needs up voltage because one of the two circuits is only operating at 110 kV and really would need to be up voltage to at least 220 kV. So there's definitely substantial grid reinforcement works required, and that's just for the phase 1 projects. More work will be required to accommodate the phase 2 capacity. On the south coast, the tomorrow energy scenario is reasonably positive, probably very much helped by the fact that, within the time frame we're talking, we'll hopefully have 2 new interconnectors connected into the south coast in Wexford and in Cork, and that will certainly help facilitate, grid capacity along the south coast. But I'm sure when ERGOT do more studies looking at connecting more offshore wind along the south coast, some reinforcements will be required as well. So as well as the very traditional approach of building more grid infrastructure, we very much believe that there are opportunities from within smart grids to stretch the grid that's already there. EirGrid, if you look at their strategy documents, have in their toolbox some smart grid solutions, such as smart wires or dynamic line ratings. And it's really a case of having demonstrated some of those over the last 10 years. I think it's now a case of taking those technologies and using them more widely to help minimize constraints while we're building the reinforcements. There's maybe also the opportunity of things like special protection schemes to stretch the network until the reinforcements are complete. So in terms of, how do we do it? Well, there probably is some precedence of this over the past 10 years. In the Southwest is probably the best example. So the Southwest, there was a requirement to probably connect about 1,400 megawatts in the North Cork, Kerry, West Limerick area, in the decade up to the end of 2020. And if you actually look at the map, that's what the grid actually looked like in the southwest in that area back in 2005 and 6. And basically there was a 220 kV line running from Tarbert down to Cork City. And then there was the underlying 110 kV network connecting up the large towns like Tralee and Listowel and Killarney. But to connect the actual 1,400 megawatts over that sort of 10-year period, the grid has basically upgraded, and you can actually see when you take the map from EirGrid's forecast statement how much has changed over that 10 years. It's still very much relying on the 220 kV line that was running through it, but it's being, well, largely upgraded, but some more works are being completed next year on upgrading it. But there's been 4 new 220 kV substations built along that line, and a lot of new circuits connecting wind farms and cluster of wind farms into those 220 kV substations. We also have put another 220 kV, two 220 kV cables across the Shannon, and there's actually some more ongoing works planned to bring a 400 kV cable across the Shannon. So when you actually look at the scale of infrastructure that was built over, in reality, it was probably more like a 14-year period. But it does show that there is a precedence of being able to do the amount of infrastructure we're talking about. And a lot of that actually does require, quite important focus from ESB and EirGrid. So for the Southwest, they actually set up a dedicated delivery board. And we very much see that being the model required along the likes of the East Coast in the next number of years, and maybe at a later date for the South and West Coasts. And that delivery board can maybe, ensure there are sufficient resources and a dedicated team and management structure to ensure that the projects are progressing as fast as can be reasonably expected. So in terms of the proposals, and they're very much listed in the Building Offshore Wind document, but also the same proposals you can see consistently across IWEA's responses to the likes of the PR5 submission that Noel mentioned earlier, and also in our submissions to things like the Navigant response over the summer and in our general grid principles document. But some of the proposals to help address grid capacity, well, the first one is to update the East Coast study to accommodate or to consider, the 4 gigawatts of phase 1 projects, but also bringing that up to 5 gigawatts as required under the programme for government. So that would be a very useful document. I think, as Noel's already mentioned, the first document that was completed by EirGrid was extremely useful, and I think there's a precedence going forward for those documents to be done on a more regular basis because they're extremely useful to industry. Second thing, and it probably overlaps very much with what Noel was saying earlier, is, the system operators, there's definitely a step up in the level of work required to deliver these reinforcements. And there'll obviously be other work going on within the system operators. Like my current view is I don't think the likes of EirGrid have ever been as busy when you look at the amount of work they're doing in the data center area, onshore wind, onshore solar, offshore wind, and other projects such as the Celtic interconnector and the North-South interconnector. So there's a big step in resources required, but we will need some dedicated resources to ensure that these reinforcements of East Coast projects are delivered, because they are critical to ensure that the offshore projects can connect into that infrastructure and also be able to export as much power as possible. So critical they have resources, and also the other key aspect of PR5 is that they're properly incentivized to deliver that infrastructure in a timely manner. And as well as PR5, this will extend. PR5 probably only brings us up to around 2025. PR6, which is the following price review period, is going to be critical as well. The sort of first step we're very much calling for, I say we've been consistently calling for this since the start of the summer, is that EirGrid, very much need to identify and start designing, consenting these grid reinforcements in 2021. If you actually look at the timelines, as we've seen in the likes of the Southwest for delivering a lot of that infrastructure, like a lot of those projects were starting at around 2010, 11 as being identified. and some of them were being delivered from 2016-17 onwards, but some of them are still ongoing. So you can see it can take 6, 10, 12 years to deliver the type of infrastructure we're talking about. So it's really critical that we're starting as early in the decade as we can. Linked into that, it's also about taking those smart solutions from EirGrid's toolbox that they talk about, but actually implementing on a wide-scale basis. At this stage, I think they've all been demonstrated, but we need to actually be seeing them being used, on an ongoing basis on actual projects. And the last thing, is that we do need this delivery board initially for the East Coast projects, so as we ensure that there's a dedicated team and dedicated focus to deliver these projects. We're also expecting, as part of these delivery boards, like industry is very, much wanting to play its role in supporting that as much as possible. So we do actually see the benefit of delivery board having input from industry, from the regulators, from the department. And we've seen the benefit of that in the likes of the DS3 advisory board, where it wasn't just ESB and EirGrid, it was a wider industry regulator group that was involved in the sort of governance of the delivery of the likes of the DS3 program. There's one other area I'd like to touch on today, outside of grid capacity, is in terms of the actual power system we're designing. And this goes back to one of the points that Noel mentioned earlier around, it's not just about minimizing constraints with the local sort of network constraints, which, developing grid capacity is critical for, but it's also developing the power system to try to minimize curtailment as much as possible. Like a lot of good work has been done in that area for 2020, particularly through the DS3 program we've already mentioned. But I think the challenge now of going from 40% up to 70% means we need to double down on the amount of work and effort that's required. For 2020, we required a new interconnector. We required increasing the SNSP from 50. Hopefully in the next year or two up to 75%, but all the other work streams required within EirGrid to ensure they were ready to run a system with high renewables. Looking at 2030, we're talking about needing at least 2 new interconnectors, and it's good to see that progress being made in both of them. We're seeing that some of that being discussed at IWEA's conference last week. But also we need to do far more work in the whole DS3 area, and it's great to see EirGrid are up for that challenge. We're talking about having higher SNSP of maybe up to 95%, but we also maybe need to see more progress being made in reducing the amount of conventional generations required on the system at times of high wind. We usually refer to that as min-gen. So we're very much planning for the 70% system, but when you actually look at what industry is developing and also what the government has called for, like this is one example of how we can achieve 70%. A modest level of increase of onshore wind, quite a lot of offshore wind, similar to what we're discussing today, and a very modest level of solar. But if you actually look what's in the Climate Action Plan, it's talking about, potentially far higher increases on onshore wind, increased solar and those high levels of wind. And that's before you take into account, the fact we're now talking about 5 gigawatts of offshore wind. So some calculations we did show that the program of government would probably bring us to, the Climate Action Plan would bring us to about 93%, but the program of government would actually probably bring us to over 100%, which brings me to the question I'm sort of asking, do we now need to start also looking at how we develop and move towards 100% RES-E system? Now, I do think there's a need to have focus on how we can develop the system required for 2030, whether 70 or 80%. But what's now different from where we were back in 2010, where we were looking at a 40% target, is we now have a longer term vision about decarbonising the full energy system in society. So I do think we need to start thinking about more than the 70 and 80% system. And we can see that, like I work across all 3 of those sectors, solar, onshore wind, offshore wind, and I can very much see that, in all 3 sectors, projects are being developed to deliver at least on the megawatts that's been proposed, in the program of government. So I do think in parallel with that, development of the actual projects, I think we need to start thinking about developing the system as well. What do we require for 100% RES-E system? So that's probably what I want to just leave us with today. So as well as talking about, those reinforcements required to minimize constraint, it's very important, and we've seen that from the other reports done in this series by IWEA, the Saving Power report. It's also about developing the system to accommodate for all this offshore renewables as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rory. So I'll just wrap up the contents of the report and the presentation. So I guess when you do all of the actions that Rory just spoke about that we've identified in the Building Offshore Wind report, what you see is that while we haven't modeled this explicitly, while we haven't modeled this explicitly, we have actually dedicated a full 70 by 30 implementation plan report to this in the Saving Power report that Rory mentioned. And what we found is if you do not progress the transmission grid, then even if you implement all of your other 7 policy improvements by 2030, your wind capacity is effectively limited to about 2,000 megawatts. Developers are not going to develop projects to sit idle in the sea. There needs to be the capability to be able to export those onto the grid. And given that the transmission system has that capability of about 1,500 to 2,000 megawatts on the East Coast by 2030, it's an area where we need to see improvement. And again, it goes back to what Rory was saying about PR5. The system operators need to be resourced in order to do this. And actually across the entire 70 by 30 implementation of plan and the 4 reports, we see this as being the single biggest challenge to hitting the 2030 targets. What I've got next, and I'm not going to go into it in any detail really, is just for the Saving Power report, we have very similar summaries tables like we have for the Building Offshore Wind report on exactly the actions that we need to take. And Rory's mentioned a lot of them around DS3, further interconnection and increasing grid capacity. And we also held a webinar on that back in August, September time. And when you get the slide pack after this, the link to the webinar will be there. Other longer term considerations which are spoken about in the Saving Power report, and huge factors which need to happen for the level of offshore wind we're talking about, are that market redesign. So the electricity market, capacity market, system services market need to be fundamentally redesigned in order to hit the 70% target and to accommodate the levels of onshore and offshore wind that we're talking about. We need to see that dispatch down certainty that I mentioned earlier, where the developers don't have control over dispatch down, and it's a very inefficient process needing to bid that in and locking it into a 15-year contract through the RES auction. It is better managed centrally by stakeholders that can actively minimize it, and that tends to be the system operators and the regulators. And then lastly, it just touches on what Rory mentioned. The grid needs to be developed beyond 70%. We need to begin thinking about 100% resi, and I'll touch on that a little later when I'm concluding. But just to round off the report, I think what you see is once we actually implement all of our policy improvements, the timelines that Ross presented earlier on look a lot more healthy. These are indicative phase 1 project timelines, indicative phase 2 project timelines. Maybe just to say that this isn't representative of every developer. Obviously, individual developers are progressing faster in some areas, slower in other areas, but it is a generic timeline. And what you can see is that if you implement the policy improvements, the phase 1 project timeline is actually cut by 3 years, and the phase 2 project timeline is cut by 5.5 years compared to a baseline or business as usual scenario. So there really are huge wins, and you'll see a lot more paralleling up and shortening of the individual steps that projects need to progress through. And the good news is if you implement all of these, and if you get all of the systems talking to each other through planning, grid connections, route to market and grid capacity, we can deliver our 5 gigawatt target by 2030, and our modeling absolutely shows that. And we see kind of peak onshore, offshore wind coming onto the system in 2028, 2029 timeframe, which really does line up with your auctions in say 2023 and 2025 when you start to see those projects coming online. So again, very important that all of these work together and that the system talks to each other in order to deliver upon those. Maybe just to touch on a bit briefly for information that the Offshore Committee and the 70 by 30 Committee or Energy Systems Group, which drove a lot of this work, are two of the main core anchors within IWEA and how we build up our membership. But we have 10 committees in total, which are filled with experts. There's about 20 to 30 experts that meet very regularly on all committees across the entire association. There's probably 300 to 400 volunteers which put their time and effort into various aspects of IWEA work, onshore and offshore, each month. And the great thing is that we can rely on that expertise from the community engagement group, the electricity markets group, to really support offshore wind development. And just to say, it's not just delivering the 70 by 30 implementation plan. We do need to tap into other aspects like the community engagement and markets, which are focuses of other reports that we've published recently in the implementation plan. Just want to end by actually touching on something which I'm sure we're probably going to get questions upon. What happens post 2030 and what is the real potential out there? And this is touched upon in the report, in the Building Offshore Wind report. The Programme for Government has set that target for a potential 30 gigawatts of export potential. But if you actually look at what's required, not just across Europe, but domestically to hit our carbon targets, which is a net zero economy by 2050, the level and scale of change required to do that is unprecedented, and we've never seen anything like it before. We're going to need huge levels of electrification of the heat and transport sector, which many people know and is a core part of the Climate Action Plan. We're going to need a lot of indirect electrification through electrolyzers to create hydrogen, to produce electrofuels in order to power the really hard to electrify sections of the economy, like heavy goods vehicles, shipping, aviation. And also meeting the demand of domestic large energy users and contributing to the wider EU decarbonisation is something that the sector will need to really put a framework together on to focus on this decade and then begin delivering upon that from 2030 onwards. And I just wanted to end the presentation with a piece of work actually that we're doing with MARI in UCC at the moment. And just a special thanks to Paul Dean for allowing me to use these slides today, because I think they tell such an important story. If you look at Ireland's overall carbon budget that we need to do to hit 2050 targets, you can hit 2050 at net zero carbon in many ways. There are very many different paths. There's an early action path where you can do and front load a lot of the action. You can take a linear approach where you try and have a trajectory from now to 2050 with very even emissions reductions. And there's a late action approach. And what we've found in our discussions with UCC and the great work that they're doing in MARI, and there's plenty of reports on this which are linked in the presentation. If you act late, you will double the amount of cumulative emissions in the atmosphere compared to acting early. So it is not possible to hit our 2050 targets for Ireland and keep ourselves to a carbon budget over the duration if we act late or if we act linearly. We need to act early. The atmosphere does not know anything about calendars, it doesn't know anything about dates, but it does know about cumulative emissions. And we need to act very early in order to save or meet our Paris climate change objective goals. And the final chart I'll just mention, and it's a piece of work by James Glynn, who together with Paul Dean and Bruno Gallagher is looking at some of the work that on what a net zero economy might look like with IWEA, and you'll learn a bit more about that in 2021. A very stark graph that I think tells the story well, that James has done some research on, is if you look at the overall emissions from the energy sector in Ireland over the last 30 years, we've actually ramped up from 1990 to where we are now, and it stayed relatively static between now and then. If you were to allow the market dynamics to continue as they are, with no climate change mitigations, a very business as usual view on how to progress investment and development in the economy, we are going to come nowhere near meeting our carbon objectives. And if you look at what we actually need to do in order to meet the Paris Agreement requirements, we have a budget in Ireland a total budget between now and 2050 of 376 million tons of CO2 that we're allowed to emit over that 30-year time horizon. The level of change that is required in the next decade actually goes well beyond what's in the programme for government and the ambitions there for the 7% per annum reduction. We need to act very fast, and we need to act now. And this amount of work that's required in 2050 really highlights that all of the actions that we've put together in the 70 by 30 implementation plan need to be carried out. Everything we've identified in the Building Offshore Wind report to hit 5 gigawatts needs to be done. And beyond that, for 2030, we need to develop our potential off the west coast and south coast for floating to meet our own domestic demand, as we need to electrify, as well as that export potential. So if you're to take one thing away from today, it genuinely is that we cannot act fast enough in doing what we need to do. So I'll leave it there, and I'll pass back to Peter, and just say thanks very much for attending today and viewing the presentation.
It's great, Noel. Thank you very much. And very much a sobering reminder of the challenge that faces us, and the work that we need to do to get to the targets that we're aiming towards. And look, thanks again to all of the other speakers. I think that was a really informative session, going through all of the various conclusions of the 70 by 30 work. And you know, there's a huge amount of information in there, a huge amount of work that needs to be done by all of the stakeholders, and I think we've highlighted the challenge that's facing us all. I think we said we'd go back and rerun the poll, or relook at the poll that we did at the start. So maybe, Greg, if you want to bring that up again, and let's see what that looks like. So just a reminder, what will be the biggest challenge to delivering 5 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030? When we ran this first, it was certainly grid was very much up there. From the look of it, looks like that's similarly the view. So that has not changed.
Well done, Rory.
Oh, Rory convinced the group. So, hard luck, Ross and Noel.
Close call.
Very good. Look, we'll leave that to run, but we might we'll go on. I know there are questions in there from the group. I was going to kick off with one myself, just sort of back to Ross, and one of the things that sort of we in IWEA have been working on, or the various committees in IWEA have been working on, is around supply chain. And there was a report produced at the start of the year on harnessing our potential for supply chain. Didn't get sort of much exposure in 70 by 30 work. Obviously, there are a lot of other issues to go through, but maybe do you want to talk a little bit about sort of the criticality of supply chain for the next number of years on top of that?
Absolutely, Peter. So there's those four key pillars. So we spoke about planning, we spoke about grid, and we spoke about route to market. But that delivery and construction piece is going to be hugely important, especially as things are scaling up globally. It's a very competitive global supply chain. There are limited numbers of specialist vessels. There are a number of other jurisdictions close to us and further afield, that are scaling up their ambition even larger than we are. So we need to start putting the building blocks in place now for a supply chain in parallel to all of this policy development that we are talking about. And I suppose the Carbon Trust report that we published earlier this year, it kind of outlined the huge benefits that we could potentially get, from building, offshore wind, building the 3.5 gigawatts. Say we're talking, over 17 billion investment over the life cycle, of an offshore wind farm from development, construction through operation and decommissioning. Huge numbers there, and potentially enormous job figures as well. 2,500, in construction and development locally, and then 700 jobs in long-term jobs in O&M as well. I suppose what the report flagged though was that we're really only currently set up for to really capture 22%, of those benefits. So there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done to do that. And I suppose called out a number of recommendations within the report. One was the need for investment and development of our port infrastructure to be able to build these projects out of, which is going to be hugely important, especially now that we've increased to the 5 gigawatts. We need to start looking at things like enterprise hubs to increase the, investment and the number of jobs in offshore wind in Ireland, and clustering around these enterprise hubs and ports as well. And then it also kind of flagged there's an enormous skills shortage in offshore wind across things like engineering, finance, and logistics that we need to support. So there needs to be a huge amount of cooperation and collaboration between government departments and industry, from now. And that collaboration has already started, but we need to start pushing on with that and build the initiatives and investment required to be able to build these projects out and ensure we're not left short and losing out to other jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely, Ross. Very important. Fully echo that. And I suppose, again, to sort of point out, and this has been said on numerous occasions, how keen the industry is to see that all of that happen, because ultimately that assists with the sort of the public acceptance of offshore wind, and sort of is absolutely critical to the development of the industry going forward. Thanks very much, Ross. We'll go on to the next question from Barry. And do you know if the government / civil service have the staff with experience of offshore environment to efficiently assess and approve projects? I don't know, maybe Noel, do you want to take a first cut at that?
I'll take a first cut, and then maybe Ross, you can also come in a bit on it. I think probably throughout the presentations we highlighted a lot the staffing requirements in places like ESB Networks, Airgrid, CRU, but we need just as many staff in the government departments. Certainly Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, the Department of Climate Action and Environment obviously as well. I think it was great to see in the recent budget that DEC have got a substantial increase in resources, many of which will hopefully be put into the offshore division and broader energy system, because the amount of work that we need from our civil servants is enormous compared to what we've needed over the last decade, and the level of change and policy changes and legislation is huge. And unfortunately, I think for the government, a lot of it is very front-loaded. It needs to be delivered in the next year or two. Otherwise, we actually can't hit 2030 targets. The rest of the system, in terms of, say, construction for transmission system or projects, that tends to happen in the mid or second half of the decade. But if we don't get the legislation right, we're not going to hit those targets. So I'd say at the moment, just to answer the question, there needs to be more resources for sure on the specific experience. I might let Ross touch on that if you know a bit more on the offshore environment side of things than I do. But I think on, say, the grid and market design side of things, I know there's a lot of really good consultants that work with the department. And I would assume that will continue in order to progress those two aspects over the next decade.
Yeah, no, to add to that as well. So I mentioned at the top of the presentation, there were certainly shortages in the foreshore unit relating to the processing of foreshore license applications. By all accounts, they have brought in a number of new staff in that space. So hopefully we're going to start seeing some returns as those license applications are processed. So that's great news. I suppose more generally, it's a whole new planning system, in a more complex and unique environment, in the marine environment, that brings different constraints, and there are different types of species living there. It's completely different. Our understanding that there's currently, I suppose, limited expertise in places like the board with specific marine ecology kind of expertise. I suppose it's definitely something that needs to be addressed, and we've certainly called it out in this report. And I suppose in another piece of work in the Mare Centre, the Airwind project that was completed recently enough or earlier on, you know, they have a deliverable within that study that's recommending an additional 10 staff within on board Panola over the next 18 to 24 months, you know, to try and support, you know, with the requisite expertise to try and support the increased scale and capacity of projects kind of entering the system there. So yeah, I definitely think there is a need to scale up there, and by all accounts, you know, they are doing that as well. But again, we'd like to flag the urgency with all of this as well.
Yeah, and I guess to flag as well, just to add to that, I mean, it's not just the sort of the consenting authority itself, but it's all of the sort of the statutory competent authorities like the likes of NPWS and so on, who are the people really at the cold face. You know, great if the board has the resource to make the decisions, but if developers can't sort of work with those state agencies to optimize and to start implementing things like the design envelope approach and tweaking proposals as technology develops, then we're not going to get the best value for money out of developing these projects. So, okay, moving on then. Next question is, this is probably one back to Ross again. How quickly have foreshore licenses been given historically for projects that have them?
Okay, so maybe what I'll do is speak to what I do know. But you know, when this issue raised its head not so long ago, we had a number of developers approach us, you know, with the length of time they've been waiting, and there are a number of projects, including the phase 1 projects, that are have been waiting for over a year for any kind of a decision on these applications. So. Yeah, quite a significant time, over a year. I won't go into detail I don't know about, but one thing I do know is that similar kind of licenses within the UK generally get processed within 14 weeks. So we're hoping to see, like I said, with the new resource coming into the foreshore unit there, that these applications are going to be processed in a speedier fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. Here.
And I'd say the absolute must is that these are done by 2021. That's what the modelling has found. If you don't have your license by 2021, it's next to impossible to hit 2030.
Yeah. Very good. Another one for Ross, the issue of exclusivity. Who's the main challenger? Other developers, offshore oil, gas or oil, or fisheries and other marine users?
Yeah,
I guess challenger is a difficult word to use in that context. You know, I suppose what we're all working towards is cooperation rather than challenge.
Absolutely, and you know, there's coexistence pieces there that are being worked on by developers with the fishing community, and you know, the Department of Housing are looking to set up an ORE fisheries working group similar to the Flow group in the UK, which will help with all of that. I think how they've kind of phrased the question, I suppose, they're probably talking about exclusivity, you know, for the seabed, you know, if there are overlapping kind of project boundaries potentially where there's two developers looking at the one site. So it would probably be that out of the three things that have been flagged in the question, I would think.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Ross. Noel, once the PR5 decision is made, is there any way for EirGrid to secure additional funding for grid upgrade projects?
Yes, is the short answer. So the good thing about PR5 is that the budget on the capital investment side of things, so the actual transmission infrastructure, and same for ESP networks on the distribution system infrastructure, is one pot of money. So the CRU don't approve individual projects on a point-to-point basis. What they do is they approve the overall pot of money, and all indications are looking like that pot will be in the region of about €1 billion between now and 2025, which is I think it's a slight increase on what we would have seen the pot from 2016 to 2020. If additional grid reinforcements are required on top of that, there are mechanisms for the system operators to go back and ask CRU to increase that budget. There's also mechanisms for if things like targets were to change, or to give an example, I guess, a lot of the EirGrid and ESB Networks PR5 submission would have been actually based on the Climate Action Plan target, because the programme for government increased from 3.5 gigawatts to 5 gigawatts. That came after the submission would have been made from them on what their budget expectations were. So once they reach the point where they need to get more revenue in order to push the envelope on the 3.5 to 5 gigawatts and get that reinforcement up and running, they can go back and they can ask for that. There is almost a step in that the system operators can use with the CRU if policy changes. So if renewable targets go up or if capacity targets go up, they can get more revenue. So hopefully they will have to use that, is the expectation.
Excellent, thank you, Noel. Rory, where would gigawatt flexible demand fit into the 2030 offshore development plan, say electrolysis or other?
I don't think I can get through any workshop or webinar without using the word hydrogen. But at the same time, you know,
hydrogen is the new Brexit, Rory.
But you know, but at the same time, you know, to some extent we brought it on ourselves. No, we brought up the idea of 100% resi and all that there. And like, if you're going to be starting talking about going beyond 70% res, you know, we did some work along the likes of Paul Blunt a year or two ago. And, you know, like definitely there's solutions there that can get us to 70% and manage it. You know, more DS3 in terms of SNSP, lower min-gen, more interconnection. But once you start going beyond that, I do think you need to be looking at, you know, more of that, but at the same time, maybe more interconnection. But I think you have to start looking at things like sector coupling, which is electrification of heat and transport. And then obviously maybe things like hydrogen coming in for decarbonising other parts of the likes of the transport sector. So I definitely think it's in the mix. I think one of the benefits of obviously being on the East Coast is you have a lot of, you know, not just electricity demand, but heat and transport demand. So, you know, we're plugging it into the right part of the country, and, you know, it probably is the time to start developing those sectors, you know, around the likes of the East Coast projects. So yes, I definitely think they're part of the mix, as well as the actual flexibility within, you know, electricity demand. You know, at the moment, our electricity demand isn't terribly flexible, but we all know going forward, you know, whether it's at a domestic level with smart meters, or, you know, whenever we electrify, you know, heat and transport, you know, we'll have gigawatts of batteries plugged into our, you know, into our houses with our cars and stuff like that there. You know, there is going to be huge more opportunities in that area too. So like, you know, without doubt, you know, what I'm reading from all that good stuff Noel was talking about from the UCC study is it's the opportunities, you know, is, you know, to solve the problems in, you know, are everywhere. And the answer everybody seems to be saying is which is the right solution? Well, we need all of it eventually. So, you know, everything that's been suggested in that question, we will need. And I don't think it'll all just happen overnight, but we need to start looking at those sectors.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned interconnection there, and obviously it's sort of peppered all the way through the various reports. Absolutely critical, and you know, we know that the Celtic Interconnector and Greenlink are sort of, you know, they're all included in everybody's modelings as fundamental underpinning of the future energy system, and are not, you know, they're not nice to haves. They're critical to how the system is going to work between now and 2030. In terms of, you know, what's coming down the line beyond that, you know, I know you've done a lot of modelling and work in this area, but what's the sort of the expectation, or what do we need to see in terms of additional interconnectors beyond that coming in either before or immediately after 2030, and sort of following on from that, when do we need to be starting to develop those as an economy and as a country?
Yeah, and that very much sort of speaks to that sort of call out that both probably myself and Noel had in our presentations, that we need to start planning for this 100% system now, which means once you look beyond 70%, you are thinking probably need more interconnection. So you probably need, one or two more interconnectors. That seems reasonably obvious when you do some of the modeling. But it also starts looking into some of the other areas like sector coupling and things like hydrogen, stuff like that. They start coming into the mix. And just the whole, reducing MinGen. So at the moment, currently 1,500 megawatts of conventional generators run at times of high wind. That's actually 3 interconnectors equivalent. So the first thing we need to do, or one of the things we need to do, is try to run our system, with at times of high wind with zero carbon system services. I would actually see that as almost my number one ask. And after that, there probably more interconnection, and after that, we're into sector coupling.
And I guess the sort of the prospect of hydrogen coming down the line opens up the sort of what we need to be talking about is not just electrical interconnectors, it's also get additional gas interconnectors if we're looking at significant levels of hydrogen export as well. Sorry, Noel, go on.
No, I was just going to say, Peter, a couple of I touched a little bit on the UCC work that we're currently doing with Mari on the 2050 net zero economy and what that looks like for the power sector in particular. But some of the results coming out of it are just staggering. To give just a sense of what we're talking about, the electricity demand in Ireland today is about 30 terawatt hours. It's forecasted to increase to about 40 terawatt hours, maybe 45 by 2030. By 2050, in a net zero economy, you're talking electricity demand between 90 and 120 terawatt hours. So 3 to 4 times our electricity demand today is what we're talking about in 30 years' time. And to give an idea of what that actually means in terms of volume of renewables required, 5 gigawatts of offshore wind would produce about 19 to 20 terawatt hours. So we need the 30 gigawatts to meet our own domestic demand by 2050. These will come. It's about the pace that they're required. One of the other interesting things, I guess, actually just coming out of the UCC study, is that in order to have a net zero economy, to give time to decarbonize heat and transport and heavy goods and shipping and aviation, to do all of that by 2050, you actually need to have a zero carbon power system at a much earlier point in time. And if you don't have a zero carbon power system by 2035, is what their modeling is showing, we will not be able to hit a net zero carbon economy by 2050. 2035 is only 5 years after our 70% target. So we need to begin planning the interconnectors now. We need to begin planning the electrolysis solutions, the demand side response, electrofuels. All of that needs to happen within this decade. It's not just hitting 70% and then stopping. That's potentially one of the policy failures that occurred in 2020, where everybody took 40%. We did such good work back in, say, 2007 to 2012 to set ourselves up for 40% in 2020. The groundwork was done there. We had the policies in place, we had the market in place, we had the auctions in place, the feed-in tariff, and then we stopped and we didn't do anything for maybe 5-6 years. We can't do that with 2030. 70% is just a short stopping point on the way to a much longer trajectory for 2050. And we'll be at 80%, 90%, 100% resi in the early to mid 2030s. So we need to begin planning for it now.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. We're just on 5 o'clock now, but I think we might just keep going with a few more questions if everyone's happy to for a few more minutes. Going on to the next one, is probably one for Ross again. Will there be offshore wind energy guidelines for the consenting authorities produced in the near future?
The short answer is yes, Peter. There will be
near future.
So they're being developed as part of the National Marine Planning Framework as one of the work streams associated with that. I suppose where things are at with that, it's due to be finalised. The plan is due to be finalised by the end of this year, and then the focus is going to be, on the enactment of the MPDM bill, and with regard to sequence, it'll be Marine Spatial Plan bill, and then they'll commence work on the offshore wind energy guidelines. So potentially the earlier projects, will have to do without any kind of offshore wind energy guidelines, which potentially adds, or not potentially, but it adds an element of risk there. So projects are currently scoping EIARs without those guidelines and using, I suppose, international best practice there. So that's probably something to flag, and we certainly want to see these guidelines ASAP and not going down, I suppose, the same route that the onshore guidelines are still going down.
Yeah, absolutely. Next one, back to Rory again. Do you think a 400 kV solution would be required for the 5 gigawatts by 2030?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Going back to the Southwest example I mentioned earlier, what they basically did down there was they focused initially on trying to maximize what they could get on the 220 kV system and strengthen it. As I said, there's now a 400 kV project coming across the Shannon, but that sort of came at a later stage. But I remember that being initially talked around in sort of 2011 or 12, but it might be delivered to 2025. Now, I think it probably slowed down to ensure the 220 kV got delivered, but it sort of gives you a flavour for the the potential timelines for delivering some of that type of infrastructure. We're already talking about a 400 kV around the western side of Dublin, which is good. It would be lovely to magic up a 400 kV ring around Dublin. But to be honest with you, it's probably about finding the balance, about maximising what can be done at 220 to make sure we are connecting, offshore projects in the second half of this decade. But I would imagine 400 kV will certainly come into the mix at some point.
Okay, very good, thank you. Next one to Ross. How long would projects generally need to carry out a survey work for a project? And can any of this work be done without a foreshore license?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so I'll try and answer this as best I can, I suppose. From talking to our members and for the purposes of this building offshore report, 3 years survey work was considered good practice, and that ensures that there's good capture of that over a long period of time, I suppose. The kind of survey work that can be done without a foreshore license, so it'll be stuff that you're not specifically in the foreshore for, I suppose, and you probably know more about this yourself, Peter, than me, working in development, but it's my understanding that things like bird surveys and cetacean and mammal surveys, now can be done in light aircraft and what have you, and wouldn't necessarily need a foreshore license for that.
Yeah, although that's very much a developing picture. So, okay, thank you. Next one then, is there enough resource across the system operators and regulators to deliver both the onshore and offshore capacity targets by 2030? I don't know, maybe Noel, do you want to go?
Yeah, I'd say we probably touched on this quite a bit during the presentation, that there's never enough resources in order to help the entire system to deliver upon this. I think it's such a step change that we will need more and more resources. And it goes back to a question Rory asked earlier on. I think if you look at the capacity targets, which the question seems to be focused on, in the Programme for Government / Climate Action Plan, we as an industry are developing more than enough projects to hit the capacity targets of, say, 5 gigawatts in the offshore side and 8.2 gigawatts on the onshore side. And that brings us up well beyond 70% renewables. The system itself probably is not planning for beyond 70% at the moment, I would say. I think getting to 70%, there's a huge amount of challenges to do that, and the 70 by 30 reports are a testament to those challenges. But it's probably another step change beyond that then that would be needed to go from 70% to beyond that in order to hit those capacity targets. So more work to do, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe this is one, back to Ross, maybe, is there a chance government could give phase 2 projects a phase 1 status?
Not as far as I know, or as far as my understanding goes. I don't think so. I think that the phase 1 projects are, those the relevant projects, and the one project that's going through the foreshore route. So I probably not 100% comfortable answering that, but I would say no. Don't know what the rest of the guys think.
I think they're working on the plan for what constitutes a phase 2 project at the moment, and we'll learn a bit more about that next year. I think what we found from our modeling work and Greg's work is that a lot of the timelines for phase 1 and 2 projects are quite similar in terms of the steps they need to hit. Like phase 2 projects need foreshore licenses by the end of 2021 as well. As an example, they need the MPDM bill as well. They need an auction up and running in 2023 and 2025. They need the grid capacity to be there. So a lot of the steps are the exact same. So it's I think we'll have a lot more clarity on what the phase 2 projects are next year, and we'll be able to better answer that question at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. I had one final question. I mean, I guess it's really for Noel. I mean, you talked about the sort of the key asks, number 1 to 6, which are sort of, you know, they're not nice to have, they're must have, so to speak, and then 7 was an ask that sort of dictated the volume of projects that can be delivered, or the volume capacity that can be delivered, so to speak. I mean, I guess you know, if we fail on 7, though, it's equally a sort of a must-have, in as much as if we fail to deliver sufficient competition, then that sort of undermines the credibility of the industry, of the offshore sector, and you know, could do significant damage to its ability to grow beyond that. So, you know, in a sense, and this is as much a comment as a question, but in a sense, it's as important as 1 to 6 as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touched on it very well. It's the competitive element of the auctions. We have the pipeline coming through, and we need as much as possible of that pipeline to be there for the auctions to drive competition, to get those volumes higher. I think what we saw in Res 1 on the onshore side, just to give an example, I think the government allowed up to 3 terawatt hours in the auction, but then the competition dictated that the actual volume procured was 2.2 terawatt hours, because there just wasn't enough projects there. And it would be a real shame to hold 3 offshore auctions and meet that ask that we have in the report, only to need to limit the volumes procured in the auctions because we don't have enough projects through the planning system, through the grid system. So those auctions need to work. They need to be competitive and ultimately deliver value for the consumer, which we know offshore absolutely can. So
yeah, and I guess it's sort of back to that point that, you know, on the IWEA pipeline survey has certainly demonstrated that there's no shortage of developers and potential projects out there that are keen and willing to engage in the various steps, and so it's whether we can get the sort of the support structures in place to bring those projects forward and make them realized as operational.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Very good. Excuse me. I think we're probably done now. We've come to the end of all of the questions, and I think that's a good a note as any to finish up on. So all it remains is to say thank you again to all of the speakers. And also to all of the people who have listened in for the 2 and a bit hours. Thank you very much for your attention, and yeah, so thanks again to IWEA.
Great, and thanks as well to you, Peter, for chairing and for sponsoring the event today. So thanks a million.
Thank you.
Take care.